In this next section on evolution, we're going to look at natural selection and some evidence for the theory of evolution. So, first of all, four main points to look at for natural selection. We have to keep in mind there is variation within populations. So, whether you're looking at humans or whether you're looking at corn plants or dogs, there is always going to be some variation within the species. Some variations are favorable, so that means that they allow that organism to survive better than somebody else of that same species. That might be height, or it might be fur, or it might be intelligence. It's going to depend on what the needs of the environment are. Number three, not all young produced in each generation can survive to the age of reproduction. And so even with animals out in the wild, we see this a lot of young either can't survive harsh winter conditions or maybe they are food for someone else. So we have to take those into account as well. Individuals that do survive and reproduce are those that have the most favorable variations. So those are the most likely to pass on their genes. And this all put together is what we call survival of the fittest. So, even though some adaptations are better suited for different areas, we have a name for this, and it's called a niche. So, each individual species in an environment plays an important role. So, whether that's here we've got a raccoon and a skunk. A raccoon is going to provide things to the environment that maybe a skunk doesn't. Or this tree obviously is providing shelter and a home, so it plays an important role as well. We've seen over time if we take out certain um, organisms from an environment, it messes up the whole system for all the different organisms. So there's a delicate balance of the importance of different species. So here we've got the hole in the log is a habitat. The skunk sleeps at night, and raccoon and sleeps in it during the day. And so they're both able to occupy that same log. Most of the biological history or the living history over time is going to come from fossils. And so we use these fossils to help compare adaptations and changes of things. And we are able to look and see what was able to survive over something they may not have. Changes that occur gradually over time are called gradualism. And so here we're looking at the Earth 200 million years ago. All of the continents were put together into one and eventually broke up over time. And this one land mass was called Pangea. And so all of the organisms that lived at that time could migrate all over this one continent. And so we can see different organisms were able to live in South America and Africa because there wasn't a division there. We can see things Antarctica, Australia, Africa, South America. This plant lived in all of those because it was one continuous continent. As those broke up and moved away, then we started seeing how these organisms changed as the different continents moved to different locations. Divergent evolution. So, with divergent evolution, often populations are going to evolve depending on how they are separated from the original species. So, a lot of times, maybe if there's an earthquake and the landmass is divided, or even oceans and mountains, think of Ice Age, how in that movie how there was a great divide and some of the animals got stuck on one side versus the other. So over time, since the animals or plants, even whatever the species might be, can't get to each other and breed, then they are going to be separated and and evolve only with the organisms in their area. So here we can see two different antelope squirrels. They live on opposite sides of the Grand Canyon. They can't get to each other. And so they have evolved to be a little bit different. And you can see their coloring looks a little bit different. And this is just mainly because of this divide in the Grand Canyon. They can't get on the other side. Homologous structures are going to be structures that appear the same in different organisms, but they often have different functions. And so we can see pterodactyl, bird, bat, very similar bone structures that you can see in a dolphin, a seal, sheep, human, very similar bone structures, but they're all used for different things. And here you can see this a little bit closer. So a penguin, a bat, an alligator, and a human. We know that their appendages, whether this is the wing of the bat or the penguin, and then the arm of the alligator and the human, the bone structure is very similar, but they're using those in different ways. Vestigial structures are structures that were inherited, passed down over time through the species, but for one reason or the other, they are unused now in that species. Maybe many generations ago, there was some use for that. And now they've evolved to where that's unnecessary. And so this is a whale, and he has a small um, leg type structure. Same thing, a boa constrictor. They don't need those now, but in many generations before, they might have used those. Here we're looking at embryology. And so if we look at these embryos in the very first row, they all look very similar. As time passes for that organism, we can see they're developing into their individual species, gorilla, bat, or I'm sorry, rabbit and fish. But the similarity of this initial embryo is amazing. And so we can see that here, a chick, a pig, and a human. Again, very similar until they get almost fully developed. Analogous structures. So these structures are different in structure, but these organisms use them for basically the same thing. So here we've got an insect and a bird and a bat. All have wing type structures, but they are formed differently. Here we have what's known as convergent evolution. So this has produced analogous structures for similar environments. So if we've got early birds, bird-like reptiles, early reptiles, they have all evolved into aquatic creatures. So the dolphin, ichthyosaur, penguin, all need to basically move in the water. And so they have evolved to fit those needs. We can also look at DNA and we can see similarities in organisms, DNA sequence, see how they might be related, how they might be different. And so if we look at DNA of a chimp versus a human, there's very similar characteristics here. At this point, we can see a little bit of a difference, but 98% of the DNA between a human and a chimp is going to be similar. Adaptive radiation. So this is saying that several different species come from one common ancestor. And so as time has gone on, maybe at this point there was a separation of land. So some of the species were separated over here and some were separated this way. And so there would be a difference in these. And then over time, maybe something else happened at this point. Maybe there was a climate change or again a natural disaster that caused different species to kind of have to evolve and adapt. And at each of these points, you can see there might have been something that caused those species to evolve one way or another. And so over time, we end up in this scenario with 6 different species from the one common ancestor. So when people think about the whole idea of humans coming from chimps or gorillas or whatever the story might be, they probably didn't come, the humans didn't come from chimps. They might have evolved at different points from one common ancestor, but not humans evolving straight from chimps. And here's an example of that. Here, this original bird over time evolved into different birds, probably different food that these birds had to eat. Maybe they were needing to eat things where they needed stronger beaks or longer beaks to get into flowers and all kinds of different things. And so here you can see, yes, Homo sapiens and chimps and gorillas, all of these have very similar DNA, but over millions of years, they have evolved into what they are now. Coevolution is where two species interact so closely that they adapt to meet each other's needs and they depend on one another to survive. And so, here an example, hummingbirds can only feed on certain flowers because of the shape of their beak, and so they have to eat the nectar from flowers that allow their beak to reach into that. And so, the important thing about evolution, you have to look at the gene pool, which is the strongest, which is going to provide for the most opportunity for those organisms to survive and reproduce.